Hi, friends. Tonight, allow me to carry you far away to the cobblestone streets of early 19th century France, where a young man named Etienne first felt the distant thunder of Napoleon's drums. This is a story of why it truly sucked to be a soldier in Napoleon's army, not just because of the biting cold or endless marches, but because the dreams of glory so easily melted into frost and mud. Etienne was 17 when the village crier's voice cracked through the morning fog, announcing the emperor's latest decree. France was at war again, and every able-bodied young man was summoned to join the Grande Armée, that sprawling mass of youth and ambition that would soon tramp across half of Europe, carrying banners that glowed with the promise of triumph. In the soft dawnlight, Etienne stood at the threshold of his mother's cottage, clutching the rolled parchment that declared his new fate. His mother's hands, worn from years of washing linens by the riverbank, trembled as they touched his shoulder. She had seen enough of these scrolls. Etienne's older brother, Luc, had marched east 3 winters before, and never came home. Now Etienne was to fill his brother's boots. Though his heart drummed with dread, there was a stirring in him too, a whisper that he might return one day, draped in blue and gold, a hero carried high through the village on strong shoulders. The songs in the taverns painted war as a place where boys became men, and men became legends. No one sang of frostbitten toes, spoiled rations, or the thunder of artillery that split bodies like rotten logs. When the day came to leave, Etienne found himself gathered among other village sons in the churchyard. Fathers pressed rosaries into palms. Sweethearts wept behind kerchiefs. The village priest sprinkled holy water on their heads as though it might shield them from musket balls and saber cuts. Etienne felt the cold kiss of that water trickle down his collar. He shivered, but stood tall, hoping to look braver than he felt. They were marched to the nearest garrison, where the Grande Armée stripped away their old lives, stitch by stitch. Peasant coats were traded for scratchy uniforms dyed deep blue. Wooden shoes were swapped for stiff leather boots, which bit into heels and toes unaccustomed to so much standing. For the first time, Etienne felt the bite of hierarchy. Sergeants barked orders in harsh accents, many from distant provinces. Drill masters slapped the backs of the slow ones with flat sticks. Every day began before dawn with the blare of a bugle and ended after dark with the promise that tomorrow would be harsher still. Some nights, Etienne lay on his straw mattress, staring at the beams overhead. Around him, the air stank of sweat and unwashed feet. He could hear boys crying softly into their sleeves when they thought no one listened. Sometimes he wondered if Luc had done the same, if his brother had lain on another straw bed in another town, dreaming of warm bread and the sunlit meadows back home. He missed his mother's stew, the taste of blackberries plucked from the hedgerow, and the hush of summer crickets. Training turned weeks into months. Etienne learned to carry a musket until it felt like a second spine. He learned to form a square against cavalry, to fix his bayonet with shaking fingers, and to shout "Vive l'Empereur!" loud enough to drown the pounding of his own fear. Some lads grew thick with muscle, others withered under the strain. A cough or fever might vanish a bunkmate overnight. They buried the weakest behind the barracks, a pitiful line of mounds with wooden crosses no one would visit. Yet each dawn brought a new rumor, of victories in Italy, of conquests in Prussia, of the emperor's horse trampling foreign fields beneath French hooves. The older sergeants spoke of the emperor's eyes, so fierce they could melt a man's hesitation with a glance. To many, Napoleon was no mortal general but a father of France, chosen by destiny to lift the nation above its enemies. Etienne wanted so desperately to believe this. He needed to believe his sacrifice would matter. At last, one cold morning, the regiment was assembled on the parade ground. Breath rose in pale clouds as they listened to the colonel's voice echo off stone walls. Orders had come. They would march within the week to join the main column gathering on the northern frontier. Whispers hissed through the ranks, talk of crossing rivers, of sleeping under foreign stars, of plunder and medals, and of course the promise of homecomings that now seemed impossibly far away. Etienne felt a thrill and an ache in his chest all at once. He fingered the letter tucked inside his coat, the one his mother had pressed into his palm the night he left. It smelled faintly of lavender. He had read it so often he knew every line by heart. Each word tethered him to the world before the uniform, before the bugle's blare, before he was a cog in an empire's vast machine. That evening, Etienne found himself sitting by a smoky hearth in the barracks, watching embers drift up the chimney like tiny spirits. Around him, boys no older than himself argued about what lay ahead. Some dreamed of fine boots and satin sashes stolen from foreign officers. Others dreamed only of surviving. A few, hardened by months of drills and hunger, spoke of desertion in hushed tones. But the sergeants were always listening, and talk like that earned lashes or worse. Etienne stayed silent, warming his hands over the crackling logs. His mind drifted to his mother's face, the softness of her voice as she told him to keep faith. He wondered if Luc had stared into a fire like this, the night before he disappeared into the Empire's endless campaigns. Outside, snow began to fall, soft and slow, blanketing the parade ground in pale silence. Tomorrow they would drill again. Next week they would march. And somewhere beyond the edge of the map, glory waited. Or so they told themselves, as sleep finally claimed them, one by one, beneath rough wool blankets that did little to keep the cold away. The snow that fell upon the parade ground lingered for days, and when it melted, it left behind a sucking mire of mud that clung to boots and turned each step into toil. Etienne's regiment gathered at dawn, the roll call echoing through the frigid air, each name barked out by a corporal whose breath clouded before him like dragon smoke. Men shivered in thin greatcoats as they clutched muskets that weighed heavier with every passing hour. When the drums finally beat the march, there was a momentary thrill, the kind born from the surge of movement, the promise of the road unfurling ahead. It was only later, when the sun sank and the cold bit deeper, that this thrill would be replaced by a dull ache in the bones and a blister blooming on the heel. They left the garrison town behind in a ragged column that snaked across rutted tracks and frostbitten fields. Villagers gathered to watch them pass, offering bread or a flask of weak cider. Mothers clutched small children to their skirts, some crossing themselves as if to ward off a curse. Etienne caught their eyes and wondered if they saw him as brave, foolish, or simply doomed. The road was their new home. By day they trudged through frozen woods and over low hills blanketed in winter's weary gray. By night they camped in ditches or crowded barns, huddled together for warmth like cattle. The sergeants barked at them to keep their muskets dry and their powder horns sealed, for a damp musket was as deadly as no musket at all when the enemy came. Food was a constant worry. Hard biscuits, so tough they might chip a tooth, were doled out sparingly. A thin stew of root vegetables, sometimes sweetened by the scrape of salted pork, was their feast when the quartermaster was generous. But the roads grew long, and supplies grew short, and men grew thin before they ever glimpsed the enemy. Etienne learned quickly how to tie his boots tight so they would not slip off in the sucking mud. He learned to hoard a piece of bread in his coat lining for when the hunger knotted his belly too sharply to sleep. He learned to match his pace with the older men who moved like they had learned how to make each step count. Not too quick, lest the lungs burn. Not too slow, lest the sergeant's stick find your back. In the evenings, fires flickered wherever dry kindling could be coaxed into flame. There were no tents for most, only cloaks pulled tight around thin shoulders and the warmth of bodies pressed side by side. Etienne lay awake many nights, staring up at the vast dark sky pricked with indifferent stars. He wondered if his mother was warm back home. He wondered if Luc had marched these same roads, boots sinking into the same hungry mud. As the days bled one into the next, fatigue became another uniform they all wore. They no longer spoke of medals or spoils in the same bold tones. Talk shifted to simple things. How many miles remained to the next village? Whether the horses would hold out? Whether the rain would come again? Rumors fluttered through the ranks like restless crows, that they would join with the Emperor's main force near the river, that the enemy's numbers were vast, that the Prussians fought like wolves in winter. Each rumor was greeted with the same weary shrug. The road did not care for rumors. It only demanded feet, blistered and bleeding, to carry the Empire's ambitions ever onward. Sometimes they passed through towns that looked much like their own villages back home. Etienne watched the townsfolk peer from shuttered windows as the soldiers tramped through, their breath misting before them like wandering ghosts. In these towns, a loaf of bread cost a week's pay. A dry barn corner could be bartered for with a ring or a good pair of socks. The locals knew well how to wring coin from hungry boys in blue coats. Yet there were small mercies. Once, an old woman handed Etienne a crust of bread still warm from her oven. She pressed his hand and whispered a blessing in a dialect he barely understood. He nodded, clutching the bread as if it were gold. He ate it slowly, a morsel at a time, making it last until the dawn found him trudging on once more. Blisters gave way to calluses. The clumsy farm boys who had flinched at the sergeant's stick now moved in silence, their faces set, boots falling in rhythm with the endless drumbeat. They learned to shoulder each other when one stumbled. They learned to share a crust of bread or a swig of brandy when a comrade's strength flagged. This was the first true bond forged in the Grande Armée. Not the glory sung in taverns, but the grim solidarity of the road. On the 12th night, they bivouacked near a frozen creek, the moonlight turning the fields silver and strange. Etienne crouched by the embers of a dying fire, his cloak drawn tight around him. He pulled out his mother's letter, unfolding it carefully so the creases would not split. He read her words once more, her gentle pleas to keep his faith, to remember the warmth of home, to trust that angels watched over him. Somewhere beyond the dark trees, wolves howled. A sentry shifted on his feet, stamping warmth back into his toes. Etienne closed his eyes and imagined himself a wolf too, fierce, lean, unafraid of the wind that cut through wool and bone. He breathed in the frozen night, feeling it settle in his lungs like an old sorrow. When sleep finally came, it came in fitful drifts, haunted by dreams of his brother's face half seen in a snowstorm, calling to him through the howl of the wind. Morning would bring another road, another mile, another chance to wonder how much longer a boy could march before he became a ghost, who simply forgot to stop walking. By the time Etienne's regiment caught its first true scent of battle, the frost had begun to loosen its grip on the fields. Early spring brought no softness, only cold rains that turned the rutted roads to rivers of muck and the men's spirits to sodden lumps. Yet beneath their cloaks, under the grime and hunger, a restless energy coiled tight, an unease that something terrible and magnificent waited just beyond the next hill. They knew they were close when they began to pass the wounded returning in carts. Pale boys with bandaged limbs lay among piles of muddy coats, eyes fixed on the passing clouds as though they no longer belonged to this earth. Some carts carried more than the wounded. Etienne tried not to look at the stiff shapes wrapped in canvas, but his gaze always betrayed him, the smell of blood mixed with wet straw and old fear. When the drums called them to form ranks before dawn, the sky was bruised with clouds. Etienne's fingers fumbled at his bayonet, checking the lock of his musket as the sergeant prowled the line. They were told little of what lay ahead. The only words the officers barked were of discipline and courage, of holding the line no matter what thunder fell upon them. They advanced in a column through a thin mist, muskets at the ready, boots sinking into soft earth. The world felt muffled, as if the air itself held its breath. Etienne's heart thudded so loud he wondered if the man beside him could hear it. Somewhere ahead, cannons cracked the hush, a deep, distant growl that made his ribs hum. At the crest of a low hill, the world opened into a wide, muddy field bordered by skeletal trees. Smoke drifted above the hedgerows, and beyond it, Etienne glimpsed the glitter of enemy bayonets. He could not see their faces, only the steel that caught the feeble dawnlight like distant stars. The order came in a single bark. Fix bayonets. Metal rasped down the line as men slid blades into place with trembling hands. Etienne's breath steamed before him. His fingers, raw and cold, fumbled on the musket stock. He thought of his mother's garden in spring, how the green shoots forced themselves through the thawed soil unknowing of frost or blade. A cannon blast slammed the earth ahead, throwing mud and stones skyward. Shouts rose, merging with the terrible drumbeat of gunfire as the officers waved their swords and bellowed them forward. They moved as one ragged body, feet squelching through churned fields littered with broken fence posts and half-buried bones of last year's harvest. Musket balls hissed through the mist. Etienne flinched as something cracked past his ear. To his left, a boy from his village dropped without a sound, face vanishing into the mud. Etienne wanted to stop, to check, to lift the boy's head, but the surge of men behind pressed him on. He fired when the order came, though his vision blurred with tears and smoke. He barely heard the muskets roar over the chaos. The recoil jolted his shoulder. All around him, men shouted, ducked, rose again, stabbed with shaking arms when the enemy line broke through the haze. They were trained for squares and charges on parade grounds. Here nothing held its shape. The neat lines dissolved in the churn of boots and blades and screams that made the air taste like iron. Etienne thrust his bayonet once, twice, feeling it catch on cloth, then slip free. He could not tell friend from foe at times, only the shape that lunged at him, and the reflex that answered with cold steel. Mud sucked at his boots, threatened to pull him down to join the broken shapes trampled underfoot. He stumbled over a fallen horse, its eyes wide and glassy. His musket was wrenched from his grasp, lost beneath bodies. In a breathless panic, he drew the short blade from his belt, a thing he had never imagined using on another man's flesh. He survived by following the shape of his sergeant's back, clinging to the barked orders that cracked like whips above the din. When at last the enemy line faltered and the bugle called them to reform, Etienne found himself kneeling in the churned field, his hands raw, his breath hitching in ragged sobs. Around him, the field was a ruin of men and horses, broken muskets and torn standards half buried in mud. The cries of the wounded rose in thin, pitiful strands that drifted with the smoke. Etienne pressed his palms to the earth, feeling it pulse with warmth that was not his own. He did not know if the warmth was mud or blood. The sun broke through the clouds at last, pale and cold, throwing a mocking light over the chaos. Officers moved among the survivors, barking orders to regroup, to reload, to be ready in case the enemy rallied again. The promise of victory felt thin here, stretched over a cost none of them had truly counted until now. Etienne found his musket half buried near a fallen standard. He lifted it with hands that shook so badly he could barely sling it over his shoulder. He could taste powder in his mouth, the bitter grit of it lodged behind his teeth. He did not know if he had killed a man or merely frightened one into the mud. He did not want to know. In the hours that followed, they gathered the wounded, dragging men from puddles and brambles, cutting away coats stiff with blood. Etienne helped lift a comrade onto a cart, the boy's breath rattling like wind through dry leaves. Their eyes met for an instant. No words passed between them. There were none left. When night fell, they bivouacked near a copse of trees. Fires glowed faint in the mist. Etienne sat apart from the others, hands wrapped around his knees, listening to the quiet weeping that drifted through the camp like smoke. His dreams that night were filled with the faces of men he did not know, men who wore no uniform at all, only eyes wide with a question he could not answer. He woke with a start as dawn stained the sky in pale bruises, his musket still clutched tight against his side like a child's toy. The road waited again, just beyond the blackened field. When morning came, the battlefield lay draped in a ghostly mist that clung to the hollows where men had fallen. Etienne rose from where he'd slept against a tree, stiff and cold, his uniform damp with dew and sorrow. Around him, the camp stirred in hushed murmurs, voices lowered as if they feared waking the dead who sprawled across the churned earth beyond. Their orders were to hold position and bury the fallen before the march resumed. Some men groaned at the delay, longing to be anywhere but here. Others looked at the misty fields with vacant eyes, as if they could already see their own shapes lying there among the rest. Etienne stood among a group given spades and canvas. They moved through the wreckage of the clash, boots squelching in the wet soil, musket barrels glinting above shoulders like accusing fingers. The smell was worst where bodies lay tangled together. The sour tang of blood, the rank promise of decay already at work beneath torn coats and pale skin. He tried not to look too closely at faces. He did not want to find the boy he had lunged at in that swirl of bayonets. He did not want to see whether the enemy looked any different from the boys who had stood beside him in the parade ground only weeks before. They worked in silence at first, digging shallow graves in the soft earth just beyond the trampled field. For each pit they opened, they dragged the fallen by arms or boots, laid them in rows like firewood, and covered them again. There were prayers at first, quick, muttered words from men who crossed themselves with trembling hands. But the prayers faded as the day wore on. There were too many bodies, too few words left. A corporal worked beside Etienne, his sleeves rolled up, spade slick with mud. He was older than most, with a ragged beard and a scar beneath one eye that made him look forever half awake. Now and then he hummed under his breath, some country tune about a miller's daughter and a dance by the river. The tune rose above the clink of spades and the dull thump of earth falling back into place. At one grave, Etienne paused. The boy they lowered there could not have been more than 15. A Prussian by his uniform, though the pale hair curling around his ear looked no different from Etienne's own. Someone had placed the boy's cap over his chest, as if to grant him a final shred of dignity. Etienne's hands trembled on the spade. The corporal nudged his shoulder. "Don't look too hard, lad," he muttered. "They look back if you look too hard." Etienne forced his eyes to the soil instead. He shoveled earth until the pale curls vanished beneath the dark weight. When they finished that grave, they moved on to the next, and the next. When the sun lifted higher, the mist burned away to reveal what they had done, neat mounds of earth stitched across the field like rough scars. The priests moved among the rows, sprinkling holy water, whispering blessings that felt too small for so much death. Etienne watched them, numb. He wondered if his brother Luc lay under a mound like this somewhere beyond the reach of France's prayers. By midday, the officers barked them to gather for rations. They chewed their hard bread in silence, sitting on upturned crates and broken fence rails. Nearby, the quartermaster tallied their dwindling stores, lips moving soundlessly as he counted. The smell of boiled horseflesh drifted from a pot where the cook stirred an oily broth. Hunger turned their stomachs, despite the iron taste still lingering at the backs of their throats. After eating, they were ordered to salvage what they could. Muskets were pried from cold hands, cartridge boxes emptied, boots pulled off stiffened feet. Etienne felt his gorge rise when he tugged a coat from a man no older than himself. He forced himself not to think of whose mother had stitched that coat's lining, whose sister had kissed that cheek for luck before he marched away. Some soldiers found coins, letters, trinkets, small treasures pocketed with quick, guilty glances. Etienne found nothing he wished to keep. When he rose from his knees, wiping dirt from his palms, he realized how quiet it had become. No more cannon, no more drums, only the caw of crows circling overhead, bold as kings among the fallen. That night they camped at the edge of the field, fires burning low as rain threatened from the west. Etienne sat with his cloak drawn tight, the flames painting his hollowed face in flickering gold. Around him, men told stories in low voices, as if desperate to conjure something normal from the ruin. The corporal with the scar told a tale of his farm back in Burgundy, how the vines grew thick with grapes that drooped like swollen jewels when harvest came. He spoke of a girl with hair like river water who sang him to sleep one summer under the vines. Etienne listened, clinging to the images like driftwood on a wide, dark sea. Sleep came grudgingly. He dreamed of the boy in the Prussian coat, standing at the foot of his blanket, cap pressed to his chest, lips moving in a language Etienne could not understand. He woke with a start, heart pounding, the dream fading like breath on a window pane. At dawn, they broke camp without ceremony. The graves they had dug disappeared into the mist behind them, hidden by the low hush of rain sweeping the fields clean. The road waited once more, winding toward the horizon, with its promise of more battles, more fields, more shallow scars hidden beneath a cold sky. As they shouldered their packs and fell into line, Etienne's boots felt heavier than ever, caked with the clay of the dead and the living alike. He wondered if someday someone would tug his coat from his shoulders and count him among the nameless mounds. The thought made him square his shoulders and clutch his musket tighter, as if sheer will might keep him upright and breathing for one more mile. In the hush of the morning, the drums began again, tapping out a rhythm older than any empire, the slow, relentless march of feet across a continent that seemed to have no end. The road wound on beneath the leaden skies of early spring, carrying Etienne and his regiment away from the churned fields of their first battle. In the days that followed, the land softened under the slow thaw. Streams, once locked in winter's fist, now trickled beside the muddy tracks, carrying away the memory of frost and blood alike. But in the minds of the men, the battle clung like burrs in wool. Small, sharp reminders that glory was paid for in flesh. They marched through villages that seemed to shrink from their passing. Shutters clapped closed at the first drumbeat. Dogs barked from doorsteps, but did not dare approach the thin, mud-splattered line of soldiers threading through the lanes. Sometimes an old woman would press a crust of bread into a weary hand, or drop an apple into a knapsack when the sergeant's back was turned. But most days brought no kindness, only the cold regard of faces peering from behind half-open doors. At dusk, when fires flickered among hedgerows or in borrowed barns, Etienne would find a quiet corner to sit with his back against a post or a tree. It was here, beneath the dim glow of starlight or a stub of candle borrowed from a comrade, that he took out scraps of paper and wrote letters he could never send. His mother's letter, the one she gave him before he left, now lay folded so many times it was thin as onion skin. The ink faded, but the scent of lavender stubborn in its creases. Each night, he read it once, lips moving silently over her careful script, as if her voice might drift to him from the hearth he missed so fiercely. Then he would unfold a fresh scrap, balance it on his knee, and write. He wrote to his mother first, always. He told her of the march, of the rain that soaked through wool and bone, of the dry bread that tasted sweeter than any festival feast. He did not tell her of the battlefield, of the boy in the shallow grave, of the way men's screams stitched themselves into his sleep. He told her instead of a stream they crossed one afternoon, how the water caught the light and reminded him of summer days when he and Luke would fish barefoot, trouser legs rolled to their knees. Sometimes he wrote to Luck, though he knew no post would find his brother now. He told Luke how heavy a musket grew after 10 miles on the road, how boots cracked and blistered, despite all the tricks older soldiers shared. He asked Luck if he had been afraid before his first clash of steel and powder. He wondered aloud if Luck had seen the Emperor's eyes, those fierce eyes the sergeant spoke of with a reverence that bordered on fear. On quieter nights, Etienne wrote to no one at all. He scribbled half-thoughts of dreams that flickered and broke apart before dawn, lines of memory like half-remembered prayers, his mother's stew simmering on the hearth, the crisp bite of an apple stolen from the orchard, the warm hush of the hayloft where he once lay listening to rain tap the barn roof. He tucked these scraps away with the others, hidden beneath the lining of his pack. Around him, the camp murmured with other stories. Some men carved their names into tree trunks, hoping perhaps the wood might remember when the world forgot. Others huddled close to the fire, trading rumors of where they might be sent next. Whispers of Russia, of Spain, of new lands where the Emperor's banner would snap above foreign walls. Each tale bore the same thread. More miles, more battles, more promises that home would wait a little longer. One evening, the corporal with the scar found Etienne hunched beneath a half-collapsed shed, scratching his words by the stub of a candle. "Riding home again, lad?" the corporal asked, voice soft with a kindness rare among the ranks. Etienne looked up, fingers smudged with ink. "Yes, though the letters don't go far." The corporal sat beside him, joints creaking like old floorboards. He pulled a flask from his coat and offered it. Etienne hesitated, then took a careful sip. The brandy burned down his throat, warming places the fire could not reach. "Better to write," the corporal said, tilting his head toward the night sky, "than to let it rot inside you. Out here, thoughts can turn on a man if he keeps them locked up." Etienne nodded. "Do you write?" "Once," the corporal said. "Long ago." But the words dried up when the answer stopped coming. They sat together in silence, listening to the wind slip through the broken boards above their heads. Somewhere in the dark, a horse stamped its hooves, and the soft murmur of other soldiers drifted on the night air. Laughter edged with fatigue, curses half-hearted and familiar. When the corporal rose to leave, he clapped Etienne's shoulder. "Keep writing, lad, even if the paper never finds its way. It keeps you whole, you see? Words are like a tether. Without them, a man drifts." After he left, Etienne read his mother's letter one more time. He ran his thumb over her name, traced the loop of each letter, as if by doing so he might conjure her face beside him in the shadows. Then he folded it away and began another scrap. He wrote slowly, the words rising and falling like the breath of someone sleeping far from home. He wrote until the candle guttered and the barn fell silent, but for the soft sigh of the wind through splintered beams. When he finally closed his eyes, the words lingered like a promise, thin and stubborn against the cold. They were his anchor. These letters never sent. Proof that somewhere beyond the road and the drumbeat and the crack of musket fire, a piece of him still belonged to a cottage where the hearth never went cold. The road wound on beneath wheels and boots that seemed to forget what rest felt like. For Etienne, the weeks after his first letter to no one blurred into a pattern of mud, rain, and commands that snapped like whip cracks above bowed heads. Each morning came with the same hoarse cry to rise and shoulder arms, the same stale bread clutched in numb fingers as they fell into line before the sky had yet decided whether to dawn. The Grand Armée did not slow for the sake of weary feet or blistered heels. If a man stumbled, he learned to stand again before the sergeant's stick found his back. If a boot wore through, he learned to stuff straw or rags inside, binding the sole tight with twine filched from a discarded sack. If rations ran thin, he learned which hedgerows offered wild onions or bitter greens, tough enough to chew, but not so tough they would tear the belly from within. Each hardship was a lesson the road taught in its cold, patient voice. Some learned quickly and endured. Others fell behind, left by the wayside like broken spokes from the Empire's rolling wheel. One dawn, Etienne's regiment crossed a shallow river, boots and wagon wheels sinking into the sucking mud of the far bank. The crossing turned the line to chaos. Horses balked at the current, mules brayed and refused to pull carts any further, and men struggled to haul their gear through the rising water. It was the kind of moment the sergeants dreaded, for in confusion, discipline frayed like rotten rope. A young recruit, no older than Etienne, lost his pack to the river's current when he slipped on a mossy rock. The water swallowed it whole, blanket, powder horn, half his rations gone in an instant. Panic bloomed in the boy's face as he lunged after it, only to be dragged back by two others before the current pulled him under. The sergeant arrived moments later, boots splattered with river mud. He struck the boy across the face with the flat of his hand. A single, sharp sound, echoing off the water's hush. No one spoke. No one dared. The boy's lip bled as he stood at attention, eyes locked on the ground as the sergeant snarled about fools who thought the river cared for a boy's hunger or warmth. When they climbed the far bank, Etienne risked slipping the boy a piece of hard bread from his own sack. The boy took it without a word, eyes wide, face still red where the blow had landed. Etienne said nothing either. It was better that way. Too many words weighed down the pack, more than any musket ever could. That night, they bivouacked in a grove of sparse trees. A cold wind rattled the branches overhead, hissing through the thin canvas of the few battered tents reserved for the officers. The rest lay beneath open sky or stretched their cloaks over low branches for makeshift shelters that flapped and snapped in the gusts. Etienne shared a fire with two older soldiers who had seen campaigns in Italy and Austria before he had even learned to shave. They spoke little but worked steadily, feeding twigs to the coals, propping damp boots near the flames in the hope they might be dry by dawn. One of them, a wiry man with a nose bent from an old brawl, showed Etienne how to wrap his cloak tighter around his legs to trap what little warmth the night offered. "Remember, lad," the wiry man said as he tucked the edge of his own cloak beneath his knees, "the cold is a patient enemy. You never fight it outright. You bargain with it. A little warmth now, a little strength later. Never spend it all at once." Beside them, the other man, older still, his beard shot through with streaks of iron gray, rummaged through his pack. He pulled out a scrap of cured meat, thin as a prayer, and tore it in three. He handed Etienne a piece without ceremony. "Take it," the older man said when Etienne hesitated. "You'll learn soon enough. Out here, it's not the strongest who last. It's the ones who share when they can and steal when they must." Etienne chewed the tough meat slowly, each bite an anchor against the wind that bit through wool and bone alike. He thought of his mother's stews again, the rich broth and soft bread, the warmth of her hands when she pressed a bowl into his palms. That memory alone made the cold seem crueler, yet also reminded him what waited if he could survive this endless road. As they settled closer to the fire's glow, the older men spoke of campaigns past, of mountain passes choked with snow, of villages where the people fled at the sight of the French eagle, of comrades left behind beneath shallow cairns marked only by broken muskets. Etienne listened with wide eyes, the flickering flames painting the men's faces in shifting gold and shadow. When the wind howled louder, one of them spat into the fire and muttered about the Russian steppes, how they might be headed east one day, where the cold was not an enemy to bargain with, but a hungry god that swallowed men whole. The words drifted over Etienne like distant thunder, part warning, part promise. Later, wrapped in his cloak, Etienne lay awake long after the others had fallen into uneasy sleep. He watched the fire die to embers and felt each lesson settle into his bones like the ache of the road. He understood now that battles were not the only test. The march itself was a quiet war. Against hunger, against the elements, against the small, gnawing voice that whispered of home each time he closed his eyes. When dawn finally came, pink and cold through the ragged trees, Etienne rose with the others, feet sore, shoulders stiff. He packed away the memory of the warm fire and the salt taste of shared meat. He shouldered his musket, tugged his pack tighter against his back, and joined the slow shuffle of boots that once more turned their faces toward the horizon. Another mile, another lesson. The road never tired of teaching. By the time the first buds of spring dared to unfurl along the roadside hedges, Etienne's regiment had grown lean and hollow-eyed, their blue coats darkened by grime and patched with scraps of cloth taken from barns and abandoned farmhouses. Still they marched, always eastward, though few among them knew exactly where the road would spit them out next. Rumors drifted through the ranks as easily as wood smoke. Some said they would soon reach a great city where they'd rest and feast like kings, that the emperor himself would ride past and nod to their discipline. Others swore they were bound for another front altogether, where the enemy's cannons were buried deep behind walls, older than any village they'd left behind. A few older men muttered about Spain, about mountains and guerrillas who struck from shadowed passes like wolves with knives. No one truly knew, and no one who wore stripes would say. So the soldiers made up their own stories in the cold hours before dawn, or in the hush that came after rations were handed out. A good rumor was worth more than a dry crust of bread, for it lifted the weary mind, if only for a heartbeat. At night, Etienne lay on damp straw beneath half-rotted eaves or curled under the thin boughs of hedgerows. He listened to the whispers around him, voices hushed, so the sergeant's ears wouldn't catch wind of talk that might spread fear or hope in equal measure. They spoke of the emperor like a ghost in a general's coat, a man who could stand before 1,000 guns and emerge untouched, his horse's hooves never muddied, his hat never tilted by the wind. Some claimed he rode among them in disguise, an eye on every squad, choosing the brave for his guard and marking the cowards for punishment. These tales made Etienne smile in the dark, though he knew better than to say so aloud. Yet not all whispers were grand or stirring. Some cut deep in other ways. One night, crouched by a flickering fire fed with green wood that hissed and spat, Etienne heard two men speak of villages they had passed, farms stripped clean of chickens and grain, barns left empty but for children who peered wide-eyed from lofts as the column passed. In the officers' tents, the men said, fine wine and salt pork flowed freely, while boys in the ranks sucked marrow from boiled bones. Etienne said nothing but tucked the words away. He thought of his mother's cottage, the orchard behind it. He wondered if someday a line of blue-coated strangers would pass that way too, if they would take her last hen and trample her garden beneath careless boots. One afternoon, after a rain that turned every hollow in the road to a brackish pool, the column halted in a ruined village. Smoke curled from chimneys long abandoned, doors hung askew on rusted hinges. A single church spire rose above the thatched roofs, its bell missing, leaving only the empty iron bracket like a toothless grin. They were ordered to bivouac in the churchyard, its old graves sinking beneath nettles and bramble. Etienne found a place beneath the lee of the crumbling wall. He sat with his back against the cold stone, musket across his knees, eyes tracing the faded carvings on the gravestones, half hidden in weeds. Nearby, the corporal with the scar and the crooked-nosed veteran scraped together dry twigs for a small fire. They spoke little, but when Etienne looked at them, they nodded for him to join. He did, grateful for warmth and company that asked nothing of him but silence. The corporal passed him a scrap of smoked fish, tough but rich with salt. They chewed in quiet while dusk settled over the graveyard like a shroud. After a while, the veteran tilted his head toward the broken church door. "Strange place to camp," he rasped. "Never liked sharing my dreams with the dead." The corporal grunted. "Dead don't care for dreams. It's the living you watch for." Etienne hugged his cloak tighter. He could feel the eyes of the gravestones on his back, rows of names half erased by rain and time. He wondered if the villagers had fled ahead of the army's tread, or if they lay beneath these stones, safe from the reach of marching boots and rolling cannon wheels. Later that night, Etienne rose and slipped inside the church. Its roof sagged where rot had eaten through the beams. Moonlight fell through the gaps, silvering the pews and the stone floor where moss crept in lazy veins. The altar was bare, save for a single candle stub someone had left behind. He stood before it, fingers tracing the cold edge of the wood. He did not pray aloud. Words felt too small here, swallowed by the hush that clung to the old stones. Instead, he closed his eyes and listened, to the wind worrying at broken shutters, to the low snore of a soldier sleeping nearby, to the distant drumbeat of rain starting again beyond the ruined walls. In that moment, he thought of Luke. He pictured his brother standing beside him in the nave, boots muddy, shoulders squared beneath a coat as threadbare as his own. He imagined Luke's voice, low and teasing. "You worry too much, little brother. The road ends somewhere. It always does." Etienne let the thought drift away when he opened his eyes. He stepped back into the graveyard, the cold air sharp against his face. Fires flickered low among the leaning stones, their glow chasing back the shadows just enough to remind him he was not alone. He lay down once more beneath his cloak, musket by his side, boots tucked beneath his pack to keep them from damp. The wind rattled the church door on its iron hinge. He closed his eyes to the sound, pressing his palm to his chest, as if to keep the words inside him from slipping free. Rumors and shadows. They filled the spaces the drums left empty. They were as much a part of the Grande Armée as any musket or saber or ragged blue coat. And in the hush between footfalls, Etienne clung to them. For in a world ruled by generals and emperors, sometimes a rumor was the only hope a boy could afford to keep. Though spring had shown its first timid green along the ditches and hedgerows, it was as if winter had not quite agreed to leave the land behind. The mornings came with a sharp bite that turned breath to mist and stiffened fingers around musket stocks. Some days, snow flurried as if to remind the Grande Armée that warmth was a luxury, not a promise. For Etienne, each dawn now felt like a wager between the sun and the wind. And more often than not, the wind won. The thin greatcoat he wore, once a deep blue, now dulled by grime and mended along the sleeves, did little to hold the chill at bay. The corporal with the scar joked that the coat was held together more by prayers than by thread. They laughed at that, but not for long. Laughter wasted breath that might keep a man warm. They were marching northeast now, deeper into a landscape that grew flatter and more treeless by the mile. Villages grew sparse. Fields stretched out in endless dull browns and grays, and every mile brought new rumors of distant cities whose names Etienne could barely pronounce. Some men dreamed of the loot they might find there, the silver, the wine, the silk curtains ripped from the windows of noble houses. Others only dreamed of hearths and haylofts where the wind did not slip its fingers beneath every seam of cloth. One night, the column bivouacked near a stand of leafless birch, their pale trunks rising like ghosts from the frozen ground. Fires burned low, fed by what little dry wood they could scavenge. Etienne sat close to the embers with 3 others, boots off for a moment's rest, toes wrapped in rags that steamed faintly in the heat. Across from him, a boy from Brittany with wild straw-colored hair cursed the cold in half a dozen ways, his breath forming a cloud around each oath. He spoke of his village by the sea. how storms there tasted of salt and fish and never cut as deep as this inland frost. Beside him, the wiry veteran worked a bone needle through the hole in his boot, the thread dark with grease to keep the damp at bay. He did not bother to look up as he spoke. "First winter's always the worst," he said. "You think you've learned what cold is, then you meet the cold that lives inside your bones." The boy from Brittany spat into the fire. "If the Emperor wants us to freeze, he should at least give us brandy enough to die drunk." A ripple of laughter circled the fire, soft and brittle like ice cracking on a pond. Etienne smiled but said nothing. He stared at his boots steaming by the coals and flexed his numb toes, trying to remember how it felt when they were warm enough to ache. That night, sleep came in thin, broken stretches. Each time Etienne drifted off, the cold found a seam in his cloak and burrowed close to his skin. When he woke, he pressed closer to the other bodies curled beside him, grateful for their warmth, no matter how restless they grew. In the dark hours before dawn, the wind rose, rattling the birch branches overhead. Etienne lay staring at the pale sky between the trunks, listening to the dry whisper of bark against bark. He thought of his mother's hearth, the soft creak of the cottage beams in winter, the hiss of soup bubbling in the pot while snow fell gentle as a lullaby outside. He wondered if she ever looked out the small window beside the hearth and imagined him standing there in the snow, blue coat flapping, boots cracked and steaming by a borrowed fire. He hoped not. Some burdens were better left unimagined. When dawn finally came, the regiment stumbled stiffly to their feet. Frost glittered on packs and muskets. They knocked the rime from their boots and stamped numb feet back to life. The sergeants bellowed them into line, breath smoking like chimney stacks above the ranks. The cold bit deeper for lack of food. Rations came thinner now, hard bread too brittle to chew without soaking, a handful of dried peas if luck favored them. Some gnawed on leather straps when hunger gnawed back. As they trudged on, Etienne noticed how men fell quieter with each mile. Conversation dwindled to grunts and nods. Even the corporal's dry quips faded beneath the relentless hiss of the wind that poured over the open land. They bent their heads, pulled collars higher, and followed the boots ahead, as if the road itself were the only general that mattered. They passed abandoned cottages, stones stacked against the wind, thatch roofs caved under the weight of forgotten snows. In one, they found the ashes of a hearth still faintly warm, a sign that someone had left only hours before. The corporal guessed at peasants fleeing before the Grande Armée could demand their stores of barley and salt pork. Etienne imagined families slipping into the woods at dusk, children pressed to their mothers' skirts, fathers glancing back at the thin blue line of soldiers that always came, sooner or later. That night, when they stopped again, Etienne crouched beside a hedgerow, scraping together twigs too green to burn cleanly. The corporal joined him, passing a stub of candle that smoked and guttered in the wind. Together they coaxed the fire to life, feeding it carefully, palms spread wide over the meager heat. "Winter's not done with us yet," the corporal said, voice low. Etienne nodded, too tired for words. He held his hands close to the flicker and watched the frost melt from his nails. Later, wrapped in his cloak with his musket beside him, he pulled out one of his scraps of paper. By the guttering candle, he wrote, "If winter finds me again, I hope it finds me home." He folded the words into the lining of his pack and lay back, staring at the drifting embers that floated upward into the bare branches. Above, the wind whispered of more miles yet to come, more nights when the warmth would feel as far away as spring. Etienne closed his eyes and pulled his cloak tighter, daring the cold to wait him out. In that quiet standoff, sleep at last claimed him, thin as it was, beneath the winter that had come too soon and lingered far too long. As the frost gave grudging way to mud and thawed streams, the column pressed deeper into lands whose names Etienne still could not shape with his tongue. Each new village came and went like a fleeting dream. Barns emptied of grain, cottages hollow as old bones, windows watching them pass with shutters half drawn as if the houses themselves dared not look too long upon these blue-coated ghosts. Whispers among the ranks spoke of an enemy close now. Real, not just a rumor swirling in the smoke of campfires. Scouts returned with stories of pickets in the woods, of sentries glimpsed through birch trunks, of distant campfires that glowed like fallen stars beyond ridgelines. Etienne listened, heart clenched tight, for each rumor carried the same unspoken truth. The march would end, soon enough, in another clash of steel and shot. One gray afternoon, the column crested a low hill where bare trees clawed at the sky. Below lay a shallow valley, the slopes patchworked with winter fields and crumbling stone fences. Beyond that, a river coiled like a pale vein under drifting mist. It was there, along the far bank, that Etienne first saw them. Rows of shapes in dark coats, standing in ranks just as he stood now. The order to halt came sharp and sudden. Muskets lowered, boots shifted in the churned earth. Etienne's breath caught in his throat as he peered through the drifting haze. The enemy looked so small from here, just lines of men and the glint of bayonets that caught the sullen light. He could not see their eyes, nor the tremor in their hands, nor the weight they bore in their packs. But he knew, with the same dull certainty that the road would always be waiting, that these boys in dark coats feared him just as he feared them. The officers paced before the line, voices crisp against the hush that settled like mist. Orders flowed down the ranks. Check flints, prime powder, fix bayonets if the drum called it. Etienne's fingers moved by habit now, the musket a familiar extension of his arm. He felt the chill bite his knuckles as he loosened the leather strap on his cartridge box. Beside him, the corporal with the scar stared across the valley with eyes narrowed against the breeze. He spat once into the mud. "They look the same every time," he murmured, voice pitched low so the sergeant wouldn't bark. "Different coats, same boys underneath. You'll see." Etienne glanced at him, but the corporal's gaze did not waver from the far bank. Beyond the enemy line, Etienne saw small figures scurrying like ants. Messengers, officers gesturing with sabers, men shifting cannon wheels into place. The wind shifted and brought the faintest echo of drums answering their own. It made the hairs at the back of his neck stand stiff. For an hour they waited at the crest of the hill, boots turning the thawed soil to a black paste that clung to soles and hems. Rain threatened, then broke in a thin drizzle that slicked hair to foreheads and trickled under collars. The valley turned to a mirror, pools forming in every rut and hoofprint. Somewhere a horse whinnied, impatient with the hush that bound the men to their places. When the first cannon fired, it was almost a relief, a thunderclap that broke the valley's spell. The shot landed short, throwing up a fountain of earth and mud that splattered the front ranks. The sergeants roared them to order. Drums rattled, flags unfurled, heavy with rain, snapping in the sudden wind. Etienne's heart raced so loudly he thought it might drown out the drums. The line shifted forward in slow, shuffling steps, boots slipping on the slick grass. The slope guided them down, closer to the river's edge where the enemy waited. Muskets fired in ragged volleys, smoke curling through the drizzle like a ghostly curtain. Etienne fired when the order came, the musket kicking against his shoulder, the sharp tang of powder stinging his nose and throat. In the chaos that followed, he caught glimpses of the enemy's faces at last. Not in rows now, but in flashes between drifting smoke and flailing bayonets. A boy with fair hair, his cap knocked askew, mouth open in a shout. Etienne could not hear. A man older than his father, eyes wild, musket thrust forward like a staff warding off wolves. For a moment, Etienne saw his own reflection in them, the same wide stare, the same tremor in the jaw. Then the ranks pressed together. Shots gave way to steel. The world shrank to the weight of his musket, the drag of mud on his boots, the sting of rain in his eyes as he lunged and braced and pushed back the fear that clutched at his ribs like cold fingers. He heard the corporal barking near his ear, felt the shove of a shoulder as the line buckled and reformed. Someone screamed behind him, a sharp, short cry that died in the hiss of rain and powder smoke. When the drum finally called them back, Etienne found himself standing knee-deep in churned mud at the river's edge. The enemy had pulled back across the water, leaving behind shapes half sunk in the mire. He watched them go, shadows retreating into the drizzle, muskets held high above the shallow ford, eyes glancing back over their shoulders. All around him, his comrades breathed in ragged gasps. Some wept openly. Others stared at their hands, as if they did not recognize the dark stains that streaked their cuffs and fingers. Etienne's musket felt heavier than it had hours before, the wood slick where his palm pressed tight. The sergeants moved among them, counting heads, barking at stragglers to fall in line. The corporal clapped Etienne's shoulder once, a rough jolt that pulled him back from where his thoughts drifted with the river's slow swirl. "They'll be back," the corporal said. "Same faces, or different ones in the same coats. Doesn't matter, it's always the same." Etienne nodded. He did not trust his voice. He looked at the river, at the far bank where the enemy's shapes vanished into the mist like ghosts who might return tomorrow, or the next day, or the day after that. In the end, he thought, the road led not just through villages and fields and shallow graves. It wound through these faces too. The living, the dying, the ones left behind in the mud with eyes open to the rain. And when sleep came again, it would bring those faces with it, no matter how far he marched. After the clash by the river, the days that followed dragged themselves across the land like a wounded beast. Etienne's regiment remained near the shallow ford, ordered to hold ground and wait for fresh supplies that never seemed to come fast enough. The fields around them turned to mire beneath the trampling of boots and horses, the churn of wagons, and the slow, dragging passage of cannon wheels that left scars in the earth deeper than any plow. Each dawn brought the same cold mist, curling low among the reeds and the crooked willows that clung to the river's banks. Each dusk brought the same hush, broken only by the crackle of damp fires and the low murmur of men too tired to gossip, too hungry to complain. Rumors, once lively companions along the road, grew thin and brittle. Even the corporal with the scar spoke little now, his eyes sunk deep beneath the shadow of his cap. One morning, Etienne woke to find a line of shapes trudging toward the camp under guard. Prisoners taken in a skirmish beyond the river, where a scouting party had stumbled upon an enemy patrol bivouacked in a thicket. There were not many of them, only a dozen or so, coats dark and heavy with river mud, boots crusted in frost. They marched with heads low, muskets slung over the shoulders of the French soldiers who flanked them, bayonets glinting in the pale sun. Etienne stood with others near the makeshift corral of broken wagons where the prisoners were herded like stray cattle. He stared at their faces, trying to fit them to the shapes he had glimpsed through powder smoke only days before. One looked hardly older than himself, cheeks hollow, hair plastered to his brow, eyes flicking from the guards to the mud at his feet and back again. Another, older by decades, stared past the circle of muskets to the distant tree line, as if seeing home beyond the frost-cracked willows. A sergeant barked at Etienne and a few others to stand guard while the prisoners were counted and their meager belongings rummaged through. Pockets turned inside out, knives and powder horns piled on a battered cart wheel, boots inspected for hidden flints or coins. The older man did not resist when a guard tugged a locket from a string around his neck. He only watched the river, his shoulders hunched against the morning chill. By midday, Etienne found himself posted at the edge of the corral, musket resting across his arms, breath steaming in the cold. The prisoners huddled together near a low fire that smoked more than it warmed. They spoke in hushed syllables he could not understand, but the tone was clear enough, fear softened by fatigue, suspicion tempered by the same hunger that gnawed at every man in every coat on this muddy stretch of land. Hours passed like drifting cloud. Etienne's feet numbed in his boots, his fingers cramped around the musket's barrel. He watched the prisoners doze in turns, heads nodding, shoulders pressed together for warmth. He wondered if they thought of home in these quiet hours. If somewhere a mother stared at a hearth, waiting for a son who might now be shivering under the wary eye of an enemy's boy no older than himself. Late that afternoon, the corporal came by, boots squelching through the churned ground. He studied the prisoners a long moment before lowering his voice to Etienne. "Keep your eyes open tonight. Some fools try to run when the moon's up. Cold makes men dream stupid things, like swimming a river in March." Etienne nodded, though he could not imagine any man wanting to slip free into a darkness that seemed colder than any prison. The corporal clapped his shoulder once, muttering about a pot of thin soup that might yet be scraped together if the quartermaster's mood softened. When dusk fell, Etienne crouched by a brazier of coals that hissed in the damp air. He rubbed his hands above the shallow warmth, glancing back at the prisoners curled like dogs in the shadows. He caught the eye of the youngest one, the boy with hollow cheeks and a smear of dried blood at his hairline. For a moment, neither looked away. Etienne wondered what the boy saw in him. Another uniform, another musket barrel, another pair of boots to be outrun or buried. Without quite thinking, Etienne reached into his coat and pulled free a heel of bread he had hoarded since dawn. He tore it in two and held half out across the broken wheel that formed the pen's edge. The boy stared, then shuffled forward, shoulders hunched. He took the bread in both hands, eyes flicking to the guards nearby, then back to Etienne. He nodded once, a tiny gesture, not quite thanks, not quite surrender. Etienne said nothing. There were no words that made sense here. He only turned back to the brazier, hands spread to the coals, listening to the river's hush beyond the black trees. By midnight, the moon rose behind a scrim of cloud, painting the camp in a soft, ghostly glow. Somewhere far off, a horse whinnied. A man coughed, spat into the mud, shifted in his cloak. The prisoners did not run. They only slept in uneasy knots, limbs pressed together beneath ragged coats. Etienne stayed awake, musket across his knees, boots planted firm in the muck that clung to every dream of escape. He wondered if he would stand in their place one day, if the road would twist and turn him from guard to captive, hunter to hunted, boy to ghost. In the hush before dawn, he found himself whispering a promise he knew he could not keep, that if he ever met this boy again, across another river, under another flag, he would remember this night, the half-loaf, the nod in the dark, the silent truth that every enemy was only a reflection waiting on the other side of the mist. After weeks sunk in mud and waiting by the restless river, a rumor thicker than the frost finally rolled through the regiment like a spark through dry straw. An officer from the general's own staff was coming to inspect the lines. They said he might carry fresh orders, or fresh hope, or, at the very least, the promise of bread that did not break teeth when bitten. Word spread on a damp morning when the mist clung low and gray. Sergeants barked the men to stand in ranks as though they were new recruits again. Boots scraped clean against rough stones, coats brushed down with frozen hands, muskets wiped free of the grime that clung to every iron inch. Etienne worked at his musket's barrel with a rag torn from an old linen sleeve. Beside him, the corporal with the scar spat into the mud and muttered that no polish would hide the hunger in their faces. By noon, they were lined along the thawing road that cut between the battered wagons and the shallow river's bend. Etienne felt his shoulders stiffen under the weight of his pack. He shifted from foot to foot, trying to keep warmth alive in his boots, eyes half fixed on the muddy ruts ahead. They heard the hoofbeats before they saw him, the distant clop and splash of a horse moving at a steady canter through the muck. A low murmur rippled through the line. "He comes! He comes!" Etienne craned his neck like the rest, caught between curiosity and dread. The rider appeared through the mist at last, a gray horse splattered to the shoulder in mud, mane braided with the neat precision of a cavalry groom. Atop the saddle sat a man whose coat blazed with brass buttons and epaulets, heavy with gold fringe. His hat, tall and stiff, perched at the perfect tilt above sharp eyes that swept the line without pause. No one spoke. Boots snapped together, muskets braced tight. Even the corporal straightened, his usual slouch forgotten for this small parade in the mire. The general's man, for that was surely what he was, with a voice like iron striking flint, did not dismount. He rode the length of the assembled men, his horse steaming with each snort, hooves squelching through the churned track. His eyes flicked from faces to gear, from ragged coats to battered boots, and back again. When he spoke, his voice carried crisp and cold across the hush. "You stand in the Emperor's name," he said. "You march for his glory. You fight for the crown of France on every distant field your boots can reach." A shiver passed through the line, not from the cold, but from the echo of home and hearth buried in that word. France. Etienne felt it stir in his chest like a coal that refused to die. The general's man gestured to an aide who trailed behind on a lean chestnut horse. The aide unrolled a scrap of parchment and read aloud the new orders. They would break camp at dawn, march east along the river, join the main column near a village whose name no one recognized. There would be food waiting, the aide promised. Wagons of bread and salted pork, new powder, fresh boots for those whose souls had vanished into the mud months ago. A ripple of relief, disbelief, and weary hope spread through the ranks. Etienne felt his knees weaken at the thought of bread that did not smell of mold, boots that did not bleed his heels raw. He wondered if it were true, or if hope, like rumor, was another ration given to keep a soldier moving forward. The general's man turned his horse and rode back along the line, slower now, eyes still sweeping each boy's hollow face. When he paused before Etienne, their eyes met for an instant, a flicker of something Etienne could not name. The man's gaze darted to the ragged tear at Etienne's sleeve, the mended seam at his collar, the way his boots were bound with twine. Then the officer looked away, spurred his horse, and was gone through the mist, leaving only the hush of hooves swallowed by the waiting road. When the order to stand down came, men sank to the muddy verge as if their bones had suddenly remembered how tired they truly were. Some laughed, brittle, sharp barks that cracked like old wood. Others sat in silence, arms folded around knees, staring at the ruts where the horse's hooves had passed. The corporal crouched beside Etienne, unwrapping a twist of paper that held a single knob of cheese he had bartered from the cook the night before. He broke it in two, handed half over without a word. They chewed together in the damp, the taste sharp and real, a stubborn answer to empty bellies. "Think it's true?" Etienne asked at last, voice low. The corporal shrugged, gnawing at the rind. "Orders are true enough. As for bread and boots, that's for the quartermaster to decide, not the man on the fine horse." Etienne smiled faintly. "I'd settle for dry socks." The corporal snorted. "I'd settle for a fire that doesn't spit more smoke than heat." That night the fires burned low but steady. Sparks drifted upward into the hush of the trees where the mist clung like old cobwebs. Etienne sat with his musket across his knees, listening to the quiet talk of men weaving new rumors from the day's thin promise. Some dreamed of seeing the emperor himself when they joined the main force, of hearing his voice ring out above the roar of drums and cannon. Others spoke of letters they might send if they found a post, of coins they might earn if the loot was as rich as the officers whispered. Etienne pulled out one of his scraps of paper and wrote by the glow of a fading ember. He wrote of the man on the horse, the polished boots, the brass that shone even under a sky that promised more rain. He wrote of hope folded into orders, of the way men's backs straightened when reminded what name they carried stitched across the blue of their tattered coats. When he finished, he tucked the scrap away and lay back against the soft earth. His boots pressed together beneath his cloak, twine cutting into his ankle. He closed his eyes and dreamed, just for a breath, of boots that did not leak and bread that did not break teeth, and of a road that, at its end, might still remember the boy who first stepped upon it with hope tucked beside his heart. At dawn, the road took them again, boots pounding over ruts that had frozen in the night and turned to black, sucking mud by noon. The promise of bread and boots tugged at the men like a lantern bobbing ahead in a fog, close enough to keep them moving, never close enough to grasp. They marched in long columns broken by carts that creaked under the weight of cannon barrels and sacks of powder. Horses blew steam into the chill morning air. Etienne's musket bounced against his shoulder with every step, its wood worn smooth beneath his glove. The corporal walked a pace behind, muttering curses at a bootlace that refused to stay tied. No one spoke much of the general's man once the wheels started rolling. Hope faded under the scrape of hunger and the slow drip of drizzle that slid under collars and down spines. 1,000 rumors could not warm numb feet. That evening, just as the sun slipped behind the last line of bare trees, the column trailed into a village so small and battered it seemed barely worthy of a name at all. The sign at the crossroads still clung to its post, letters half-scraped by wind and years of frost. Etienne sounded out the shapes on the wood, but could not force them into any word that lived on his tongue. The corporal read it for him, squinting as they passed. Saint-Laurent-sous-Bois. "It means nothing," the corporal said with a shrug. "Like half the places we find. Just a dot on a map some officer forgot to scratch out." The village looked as if winter had given up gnawing at it only because there was so little left to chew. The church had lost its roof to a storm or cannon fire, and the cottages leaned like old drunks in the dusk. A single well in the square held water slick with leaves and the ghosts of 1,000 cold hands. Some doors swung open on empty houses. Others were barred shut, but no smoke curled from any chimney. They bivouacked where they could, in doorways, under sagging eaves, in barns where mice watched from rafters. Etienne found a corner in what might once have been a cooper's shop. The ring of old barrels stacked like ribs against the wall. He settled beside one, grateful for its meager shelter from the wind. Later, the quartermaster's promises arrived at last, in the form of 2 wagons rumbling down the track, wheels screaming in the ruts. Men surged around them like starving dogs. The first wagon held barrels of salted fish and sacks of weevilled flour. The second, crates of boots so mismatched and worn they looked more like relics than salvation. Etienne joined the line with the corporal. When their turn came, they each received a tin cup of fish stew, thin as river water, and a heel of bread speckled dark with old grain. They said nothing as they ate. Words could not sweeten what hunger already claimed. The boots were worse. Etienne held up a pair that looked 2 sizes too large, the soles half rotted, the leather stiff with old mud and older salt. The corporal laughed when he saw them. "Think of it this way, lad. More room for straw to keep your toes from freezing." They sat in the cooper's shop, stuffing handfuls of dry hay into their new prizes. Etienne tugged the boots over rag-wrapped feet and felt the weight settle him deeper into the cold earth. He tried not to imagine how long they might last before the road devoured them, too. Later that night, the rain turned to sleet. It drummed on the broken roof beams and whispered through gaps in the boards. Etienne pulled his cloak tighter, musket at his side, the corporal's quiet snore the only anchor to remind him he was not alone. Sleep came in uneasy drifts. Somewhere in the black hush beyond the cracked wall, Etienne heard footsteps. Soft, cautious, not the heavy tread of boots, but the whisper of bare soles on frozen ground. He sat up, heart knocking his ribs, hand curling around the musket's barrel. Through a knot in the wall, he glimpsed a shape darting between the barrels outside. Small, thin, more shadow than boy. He rose slowly, boots creaking, and slipped out the door. In the yard behind the shop, the shape froze beneath the crook of an old apple tree. Etienne raised his musket but did not level it. The boy, for now he saw it was a boy, no older than 10, clutched a burlap sack to his chest. His eyes glinted in the spill of moonlight, wide with a fear Etienne knew too well. They stared at each other a long moment. The boy's breath came in clouds. He shifted one bare foot against the icy mud, ready to bolt. Etienne lowered the musket and held out an empty hand. "I have nothing worth stealing," he whispered, though he knew the boy could not understand him. The boy said nothing, only clutched his sack tighter. Etienne stepped closer, slow as a prayer. He reached into his coat and drew out the last scrap of bread from his ration, hard as stone but real. He held it out. The boy's eyes darted from Etienne's face to the bread, to the musket barrel, and back. After a heartbeat that stretched forever, he crept forward, snatched the bread, and vanished into the orchard's shadows without a sound. Etienne stood in the hush that followed, breath ghosting in the moonlight, hands still outstretched as if the boy's warmth lingered there. He wondered who the child belonged to, if anyone remained to claim him at all, or if he, too, was now just another shape drifting between empty cottages, scratching at the edge of an army's hunger. When he slipped back into the cooper's shop, the corporal stirred, cracked one eye, and grunted. "Trouble?" "No," Etienne said, settling under his cloak again. "Just a ghost looking for bread." He closed his eyes to the sleet rattling on the beams, wondering how long this village called Nowhere would cling to his dreams. A dot on a map, half scraped and half forgotten, where the road paused just long enough to remind him that mercy was as thin and cold as the rain that always found its way in. At dawn, the sleet turned back to rain, soft but relentless, drumming its slow tattoo on the broken roofs of Saint-Laurent-sous-Bois. Etienne woke to the sound of boots sloshing through puddles in the yard beyond the cooper's shop, the low murmur of voices, and the restless shuffling of men eager to move on. The corporal was already up, fussing with the twine that bound his pack, muttering curses at a strap that refused to hold its knot. No bugle called them this morning. The sergeants simply walked the lanes, boots sinking in the soft mud, snapping their sticks against doorposts to drive the men from corners and lean-tos where they had curled themselves like dogs against the chill. Etienne wrapped his cloak tight and slipped his arms through the straps of his pack. The new boots, stuffed with straw, pinched his toes in odd places, but were better than the cracked pair that now lay discarded in the orchard behind the shop. They formed ranks along the village road, muskets resting on shoulders slick with rain. Somewhere up the line, an officer's horse snorted and pawed at the mud, impatient for the slow column to uncoil and drag itself eastward once more. Etienne stood beside the corporal, eyes half closed against the drizzle. He tried not to think of how many miles lay ahead or where the next meal might be found. As they waited for the order to march, Etienne's eyes wandered to the orchard that stretched behind the cooper's shop, a ragged stand of apple trees, their branches black with rain, scattered with the ghosts of last autumn's fruit. He remembered the boy from the night before, how the shadow had darted beneath those branches, sack clutched tight, eyes wide and hollow. Some small knot in Etienne's chest tugged him sideways before he could think better of it. He slipped from the line when the corporal's back was turned, boots squelching through the mire toward the orchard's edge. No sergeant barked his name. There was too much confusion up the road as carts jammed in the village square, horses balked, and men cursed the sucking mud that ate each step. Beneath the dripping trees, the orchard was silent, but for the patter of rain on empty branches. Etienne pushed aside a tangle of brambles and stepped into the gloom between the trunks. Beneath one tree, half buried in wet leaves, he found what he had hoped for. A scattering of shriveled apples, skin wrinkled and blackened by frost, but still clinging to a hint of sweetness beneath the rot. He crouched and picked through them, turning each in his palm. Some were soft as bruises, others frozen hard as stones. He found 3 worth the trouble. Small, sour things that might ease a hollow belly if boiled into the next pot of thin stew. When he rose, he caught a flicker of movement at the orchard's edge. The boy again, standing half-hidden behind a fallen log, sack pressed to his chest. Their eyes met. Etienne raised a hand, the apples resting in his palm like an offering. The boy did not come closer. Rain dripped from his tangled hair onto the sack's rough cloth. They watched each other across the orchard's hush, until Etienne set one apple down on the mossy log and stepped back, boots squelching in the mud. The boy waited a heartbeat, then darted forward, snatched the apple, and vanished between the trees. Etienne lingered a moment longer, listening for footsteps, for a voice, for any sign that someone would call the boy back from the shadows. But the orchard only answered with the soft sigh of rain and the whisper of branches brushing together overhead. He turned and made his way back to the road, apples tucked deep in his coat pocket. When he slipped back into line, the corporal shot him a look, sharp, questioning, but softened by a smirk that said he would not bother to ask. "You find what you were after?" The corporal murmured as the line began its slow crawl forward. Etienne patted his pocket. A little sweetness left in this place. The corporal chuckled. "Better watch your teeth. The road doesn't spare a man just because he's clever enough to find an orchard." They tramped out of Saint-Laurent-sous-Bois as the sun dragged itself behind the clouds, offering no warmth, only a gray promise that the rain would keep pace for miles yet. Behind them, the village sagged back into its hush. Empty houses, leaning fences, the orchard waiting for the next hungry boy, who might remember there was still fruit clinging to the branches when the road carried the soldiers away. By noon, Etienne bit into one of the apples as they trudged through a stretch of churned fields. It was sharp on his tongue, sour enough to pucker his mouth, but the taste reminded him of summers long gone, of Luke tossing him green apples over the orchard wall at home, both of them laughing as they ran from their mother's scolding voice. He chewed slowly, letting the memory warm him from within, if only for a mile or two. The corporal nudged his elbow when he finished and held out a battered tin cup half full of rainwater. They shared the last bites in silence, boots splashing through ruts that filled faster than they emptied. Behind them, the village called nowhere, Saint-Laurent-sous-Bois, slipped into the folds of the mist. No marker would keep its name alive in any history worth reading, Etienne knew. but in his pocket, 2 small apples knocked together with each step, proof that not every orchard was lost. Not every scrap of sweetness gone from a world that asked boys to trade their hunger for a uniform, and the hope that someone, somewhere, would remember they had once belonged to softer fields. When they made camp that night, Etienne wrote it down. A village with no name, an orchard with no fruit worth stealing, and a boy with no voice who reminded me the road has corners where mercy still hides, waiting for brave feet to find it. He folded the scrap into the lining of his coat, a secret sweetness to carry on when the road turned cold again. After Saint-Laurent-sous-Bois fell away behind them, the road found its rhythm again, that same dull beat of boots in mud, wagon wheels grinding through ruts, hooves clopping in steady complaint. The drizzle faded, replaced by a damp wind that slipped its fingers under collars and sleeves, chilling sweat to ice along every man's spine. To keep from sinking into the hush that always threatened when the road stretched too long, someone near the front began to sing. A thin voice at first, cracked by cold air and hunger, but it caught hold like a spark in dry straw. One by one, voices rose from the line, rough, tuneless, carried more by the rhythm of feet than any true melody. The song was an old marching tune, older than this war, and the last one too. Etienne had heard it first from Luc, back when they would run through the orchard at dusk, Luc drumming the beat on his brother's shoulders. On the road we go, on the wind we ride, where the fields are wide, and the cannon roar beside. The words shifted with each voice, verses traded or forgotten, new ones invented to mock the sergeants, the cold, the lies about bread wagons that never came. Some boys laughed as they sang, but the sound had a brittle edge, a forced cheer that cracked when the wind howled across the open fields. Beside Etienne, the corporal joined in with a low hum, tapping the rhythm against the stock of his musket. His breath smoked in the dawn air, carrying old pipe tobacco and stale rations. Every so often he slipped into silence, gaze drifting over the lines of heads bobbing before them. Boys and old men alike, all bound together by the same muddy road and the same tune rattling in their ribs. By midday, the song faded, replaced by the grunt and shuffle of boots dragged through clay that clung to soles, until each step felt like lifting a stone. The column paused only long enough to swallow hard bread, cracked teeth against dry crust, then tramped on. In the afternoons, the horizon teased them with shadows of farmhouses or distant smoke. Each time, a ripple of hope passed down the line. Maybe a hearth, a warm corner in a barn, a scrap of stew in a blackened pot. But often the farms were already stripped bare, the doors swinging wide on empty rooms, chickens long fled or eaten, cellars bare but for rats fatter than any soldier's belly. One dusk, as the sun bled out behind clouds, the regiment stumbled upon a cluster of stone huts half buried in the folds of a low hill. The wind smelled faintly of sheep and old hay. They bivouacked there without orders, too tired to wait for barked commands. Men slipped inside the huts in pairs and threes, grateful for walls to blunt the wind's cruel teeth. Etienne found a corner under a thatch roof that let the night through in thin drips. He sat with the corporal and 2 boys from the southern provinces, who still carried the soft burr of vineyard hills in their speech. They lit a scrap of candle and passed a battered tin between them, each sipping a mouthful of rainwater and stale wine, mixed from an old flask the corporal had bartered for half his last ration of bread. One of the vineyard boys began to hum again, the same tune they had sung that morning. His voice was soft now, barely a breath above the hush of the wind that rattled the hut's door. The notes curled through the shadows, weaving between the flicker of candlelight and the drifting threads of their unspoken thoughts. When the song died, Etienne found himself speaking without meaning to. "Luc used to sing that," he said, voice rough. "Back home, he always added new verses, about how he'd come back with pockets full of coins and boots polished bright enough to blind the village girls." The corporal grunted. "Did he come back shiny like that?" Etienne shook his head. "He didn't come back at all." No one asked more. Silence held them, a kind that did not press or demand, but simply sat beside them like an old hound, patient and sad-eyed. After a time, the corporal shifted and pulled from his coat a twist of cloth. Inside lay the last scrap of salt pork, tough and thin as parchment. He tore it into strips and passed them around. No one thanked him. Thanks made it too heavy to swallow. They chewed in the hush, letting the brine bite their tongues while the candle guttered lower. Outside, the wind carried the faint echo of other voices. Boys pressed together in other huts, muttering in sleep or talking low of places far behind them. Etienne wondered if the road ever grew tired of all these voices, if it gathered up every word and stored them in its ruts like secrets pressed into soft earth. When the candle hissed out at last, Etienne leaned back against the cold stone wall. He pulled his coat tight around his shoulders, feeling the rough press of the orchard apples still hidden in his pocket, a sweetness he had not yet dared to spend. In the dark, he let the old marching tune wander through his mind again, Luke's voice clear and bright, calling him down orchard paths where no cannon waited, where boots left only soft prints in warm dust. He drifted off there, between the hush of the wind and the hollow promise of songs sung too often. And when dawn stirred him awake, boots to be laced and muskets to be shouldered once more, he held the ghost of that tune tight in his chest, a fragile shield against a road that asked for more than any boy should ever have to give. They left the cluster of stone huts before dawn, breath steaming as they filed out past half-broken fences and frost-silvered sheep paths that wound away into hills veiled by drifting mist. The old marching tune still lingered in some throats, but softer now, a murmur beneath the scrape of boots and the hollow clatter of tin cups bouncing against packs. Etienne moved with the line, the corporal just behind him, humming tunelessly as he knocked mud from his boot heel with the butt of his musket. The southern boys trudged ahead, shoulders hunched, heads low, speaking now and then in words Etienne did not catch, but found oddly soothing in their gentle rise and fall. The road veered east across open fields that rolled under a sky so wide it made even the longest march feel small by comparison. To either side, low stone walls snaked along the ridgelines, half swallowed by thorn and bramble. Crows watched from the posts, black beads of eyes following the shuffling line, as if waiting for the road to do what frost and hunger had not yet finished. By mid-morning, the wind rose, dry and sharp, sweeping down from the distant hills where old farmhouses clung like stubborn teeth against the bare slopes. The sun made a pale promise, but offered little warmth, its pale coin flickering behind racing clouds. As they passed a fallow pasture, Etienne glimpsed the remains of a small camp. Ashes blackened the hollow of a ditch. Scorched tin pots lay scattered among old boot prints. The corporal paused beside him, scratching his cheek beneath the fringe of his scarf. "Rear guard, maybe," he said. "Or just poor fools like us. Not enough boots or powder to stick with the column, so they melt into the hedgerows." Etienne said nothing. He wondered where such men drifted when the army marched on without them. Did they wait in barns for a scrap of bread? Did they trade their muskets for a quiet mile of ditch where no sergeant's stick could find them? By dusk, they reached a broad meadow rimmed with sparse trees that scratched at a sky bruised with coming rain. Here the order was given to halt for the night. No village, no barn, only open grass turned to damp earth beneath 1,000 boots. The men set about gathering branches, half-rotted logs, anything that might catch flame against the creeping dark. Etienne and the corporal worked side by side, hacking at a tangle of dead brush near a stunted oak. Each snap of a twig echoed in the hush between them. When they returned to the meadow's edge, they found a circle of boys from other companies huddled around a fire that smoked and hissed, too green to burn cleanly but enough to warm fingers gone stiff with cold. They sat shoulder to shoulder, boots steaming as they thawed near the flames. One boy, thin as wire and too young for the lines on his face, drew a bone flute from his pack and lifted it to his lips. The tune that drifted out was no marching song, but an old country air, the kind that once danced through summer fields where scythes swung low and children hid in the wheat. The melody tangled with the crackle of damp wood, softening the hard edges of the cold night. Etienne felt it slip under his coat like a breath of warmth, though he knew it could not stay long. He pulled one of the orchard apples from his pocket, the last of them, and turned it over in the firelight. The skin had begun to bruise where it knocked against his musket stock mile after mile. Without a word, he handed it to the corporal. who raised an eyebrow but said nothing as he bit into the sour flesh. He passed it around the circle, each man taking a small bite, careful not to waste a drop of the sweetness hidden inside. When it came back to Etienne, only the core remained. He tucked it into his coat. Not out of greed, but as if carrying that scrap of orchard might root him to the memory of softer days. The boy with the flute finished his tune and tucked the little pipe back into his pack, eyes distant as though he heard echoes of some other place far from this open meadow under the restless wind. Someone passed around a tin of boiled roots, bitter but warm. Hands cupped it, one after another, the meager broth steaming ghost-like into the night. When the food was gone, Etienne lay back on his cloak, boots pressed close to the dying warmth of the fire. Overhead, the sky stretched wide and clear at last. Stars spilled in careless handfuls across the dark. He let his eyes trace them, lines that meant nothing yet felt as if they might spell out the shape of home if he looked long enough. Beside him, the corporal tugged his own cloak tight and muttered about the cold that would creep in before dawn. He offered no complaint, no curse, only the small fact of it, spoken like a man too familiar with nights that asked more than daylight could repay. Etienne thought of Luc again. Not of parades or drums or songs of glory, but of a summer night under the orchard trees, both of them flat on their backs in the grass, pointing at the stars and making up stories about kings and saints whose names no one truly remembered. The road stretched far beyond this field, that much he knew. Battles waited, rumors waited, frost and hunger and miles of mud yet clung to his boots. But for one heartbeat, beneath the brittle hush of the wind and the flicker of the last ember at his feet, Etienne let himself believe the sky might hold him gently. A roof too high for any general to command, too vast for any drum to drown. Sleep found him there, under the open sky, wrapped not in warmth but in the stubborn hope that someday the road would give back what it had taken, and that when it did, he would still remember how to lie beneath the stars and feel like a boy again. Morning came brittle and bright, cold enough to crack the thin crust of frost that had crept into blankets and found every seam in ragged boots. Etienne woke to the hush of men packing up, stamping warmth into their feet, shaking stiff fingers before tugging on damp gloves. Smoke from last night's fires drifted low across the meadow, mingling with breath and the faint rustle of hooves from the supply wagons grinding into place. An hour later, they were on the road again, boots sinking into thawing ruts, packs biting at shoulders already rubbed raw. They marched toward Rumors as usual, a town just over the hills, a village too stubborn to empty its cellars before the Grande Armée arrived. Bread, salt pork, real soup. These words traveled down the line like coins flicked from hand to hand, promises heavy enough to keep men moving, light enough to vanish before they could be spent. Near midday, they crossed into the outskirts of a manor estate. Stone walls half collapsed under years of storms and neglect. An iron gate rusted into its hinges. Beyond it, the house rose gray and aloof above a tangle of orchard and weed-choked gardens. Etienne glimpsed broken windows, curtains stirring behind cracked glass. The place looked empty, but they all knew the truth of such places. There was always something left behind, even if only a scrap of warmth or a crust tucked in the back of a cupboard. The line was ordered to halt while officers and their staff claimed the main house for headquarters. The rest were told to wait, scattered among the hedgerows and old orchard, rifles grounded, packs dropped at their feet. Some men curled against the stone wall, cloaks pulled tight, eyes slitting shut for any scrap of sleep that might steal them from the cold. Etienne found a spot beneath a tangle of bare branches, the corporal settling beside him with a grunt. Together they listened to the distant sound of doors slamming open, the bark of officers' voices echoing through the grand hall. A wagon rolled through the gates, its wheels rimmed with mud and crates stacked high beneath a tarpaulin that sagged under the weight of what every man watching could guess. Food. "You think they'll leave us the bones?" the corporal muttered, voice low. Etienne did not answer. His eyes tracked the line of servants. Local peasants pressed into service, or soldiers unlucky enough to be picked for kitchen duty, carrying crates through the broken doors. A smell drifted out, soft at first, then sharp enough to snap the air. Salted meat, old wine, the promise of warmth that came not from a fire but from a pot boiling steady on a hearth no rancor would see. Somewhere deeper in the orchard, a murmur rose, boys from another company trading sharp words about stealing inside, about slipping through a cellar window, about what punishment might find them if the sergeant caught their boots muddying a marble floor meant for generals' polished heels. The corporal watched them, shaking his head. "Better a raw belly than a raw back," he said. "Seen a lad flogged clean for half a crust once. Better to chew your own boot leather than try your luck with an officer's table." Etienne's stomach nodded at the thought. He could almost taste the stew, onions melting in fat, carrots soft, steam clinging to a chipped bowl held in hands that hadn't known warmth in weeks. His mouth filled with a thin wash of bitterness that he swallowed down with the taste of last night's orchard ghost. A thin snow began to fall as they waited. Fat flakes that melted on shoulders but caught in eyelashes and hair. Etienne tilted his head back, letting them brush his cheek, cold and clean. Somewhere far behind them in the line, a boy began humming the old marching tune again. It drifted through the orchard like smoke. "On the road we go, on the wind we ride." Hours passed that way. The snow thickened. The officers' feast carried on behind closed doors and curtained windows. Etienne saw shadows pass across the cracked panes. Men standing, men laughing, wine raised in a toast while the orchard and its ragged circle of boots and muskets shivered in silence. By dusk, the corporal pulled a scrap of cloth from his coat and unfolded it. Inside lay half a heel of bread, hard as stone, saved from 2 mornings ago. He broke it in 2 and handed Etienne the larger piece without a word. They chewed in the hush, the snow whispering over branches above them, the wind carrying the faint clatter of cutlery and porcelain from somewhere behind the manor walls. When the bread was gone, Etienne leaned his head back against the trunk and let his eyes drift shut. He did not dream of the officer's table, not the bread or the wine or the soup rich enough to make a man weep. He dreamed instead of his mother's hearth, of Luke wiping a wooden spoon across his mouth, grinning with broth on his chin. He dreamed of the taste of soup not earned by a musket's bark, but by the soft hush of a family gathered tight against the cold. When he woke, the orchard was dark, but for the dim glow of lanterns flickering behind cracked windows. The corporal stirred beside him, boots tucked close, musket cradled in the crook of one arm like a sleeping child. "They'll call us up soon enough," he rasped. "A new order, a new mile. You'll see." Etienne only nodded. He stared through the drifting snow at the house that gleamed with warmth and laughter they could not touch. He pressed his hand to the pocket where the orchard apple had once been, felt the ghost of its shape, and told himself that one day the road would lead him to a hearth where every man might sit at the same table, warm, fed, whole. But the snow only fell thicker, muffling the orchard, the manor, the cold iron of their hope. And in that hush, Etienne pulled his cloak tighter, boots drawn to his chest, waiting for the road to find him again come dawn. The snow fell heavier through the night, draping the orchard and the half-ruined manor in a hush, so deep it seemed even the wagons dared not creak. When dawn broke, it brought no warmth, only a gray, reluctant light that found Etienne stiff and hollow-eyed beneath his cloak, boots damp where melting flakes had seeped through the seams. By mid-morning, the line stirred awake at the bark of sergeants trudging between the trees. Orders came down rough and cold. The regiment would move again by midday, following the river east where it curved past villages too small to hold a name on any officer's map. There was talk of joining the main column at last, though no one quite said where the main column lay now. Some whispered it had vanished into the snows that swallowed men by the mile. As Etienne stamped warmth into his feet and checked the flint of his musket, he heard the corporal cursing beneath his breath. A boy from the southern company had slipped away in the night, not a ghost, but a deserter now, boots leaving a thin trail through the orchard's hush and over the low wall where the frost-bitten orchard gave up its last shelter. Deserters were not rare. The road taught every man when his courage ended and his fear of the rope found him again. Sometimes they found them days later, blue and stiff under drifts, muskets abandoned in the ditch. Sometimes they found only the whisper of a trail, footprints that led away into a hush where no drumbeat could reach. This morning, though, the officers were furious. A group of men were ordered to follow the boy's trail, drag him back if they could, make an example of him if they must. The corporal muttered that such theater wasted time and boots. But when his name was called to join the search party, he shrugged his pack onto his shoulders and clapped Etienne on the arm. "Keep your boots dry if you can, lad," he said. "If we don't find him by dusk, we'll find each other on the road again." Etienne watched them slip away into the orchard's white hush. A file of blue coats threading between the trees, muskets held loose but ready, eyes squinting to follow the line of boot prints pressed faint into the drift. When they vanished over the low stone fence, the orchard seemed emptier still. Etienne tightened his pack, hoisted his musket, and joined the waiting line that snaked from the manor gates down the frozen track. Word passed down that the officers had feasted late into the night. The empty barrels left behind told the rest. Good wine, salted pork, bread fresh enough to soften teeth cracked by ration biscuits. None for the men who carried the emperor's flag on mud-caked shoulders. The road did not waste its best for those who marched. By midday, they were moving again. Etienne fell into step beside the southern boys, heads down, eyes fixed on boots that vanished into the frost-muddied ruts. None spoke of the deserter now. The word was taboo, a curse pressed under the tongue. A man who ran broke the spell that bound them to the road, proved it was not iron or glory that held their feet steady, but the fear of rope and powder and the cold waiting at the edges of the column. They marched until dusk softened the snow to a dull smear across low fields. Here and there, lone cottages hunched behind crooked fences. Shutters slammed tight at the first drumbeat. No doors opened. No fire's glow spilled out to soften the road's edge. When the halt was called, they bivouacked in a shallow hollow where an old willow drooped its bare branches over a frozen stream. Etienne scraped a bed into the drift beneath a fold of roots. Boots propped near a small fire he coaxed with twigs. His breath plumed in the hush, the only warmth left to mark him alive. It was there, as the fire hissed and popped, that the search party returned. Etienne saw them crest the low rise near the road, dark shapes beneath a sky bruised with dusk. The corporal trudged at the front, musket slung loose, eyes fixed on the ground. Behind him, two men dragged something between them, a bundle of blue wool and cracked boots, limp as a sack of grain. No words were spoken when they passed. No cheer of capture, no jeer for the coward. Only the shuffle of boots and the soft hiss of snow trampled underfoot. Etienne lowered his eyes as they passed. He did not need to see the boy's face to know what the road did to hope that slipped away in the night. Later, by the fire's glow, the corporal dropped beside him, breath steaming through the rough bristle of his beard. "He was already half gone when we found him," he said, voice flat. Frost took his feet first, then his mind. "We found him curled in a ditch, boots off, laughing at the snow." Etienne stared at the coals, watched them crackle red against the hush. "Did he say anything?" The corporal shook his head. "Nothing worth hearing, only his mother's name, over and over, like a prayer for the wolves." Silence bound them close. Somewhere across the hollow, another fire sparked. Etienne could hear the crack of an axe splitting frozen branches, the low murmur of boys too young to carry the weight of a deserter's ghost to sleep. When the corporal rose, he pulled the last heel of bread from his pack and tore it in two. He held half out to Etienne, who took it with numb fingers. "Eat," the corporal said. "Tomorrow the road calls us all, no matter where we think to run." Etienne chewed the bread slow, the taste dry as ash, but real against the chill that gnawed at his ribs. He watched the embers drift upward into the willow's drooping boughs and wondered if the road ever forgave the ones who slipped away, or if it simply waited, patient and hungry, for the boots that never learned when to stop. When sleep came, it brought no dreams. Only the faint drum of the stream beneath its crust of ice, whispering that the march would always find them, footprints pressed deep into snow that forgot them by morning. At first light, the sky offered only a bruised promise of dawn behind a wall of drifting cloud. Etienne woke to the hush of men packing their gear in the frozen hollow by the willow. The stream beneath its thin crust whispered in the dark, a slow reminder that water still moved somewhere below the frost, even when Boots stumbled on its brittle skin. The night had not been kind. Frost clung to beards and eyelashes. The corporal's boots, stuffed with straw, had frozen stiff around his feet. Etienne helped him pry them loose near the embers of a dying fire, the two of them muttering curses at the cold like a prayer too tired to rise beyond their breath. They fell into line before the sun found its way over the low ridge. The column snaked eastward once more, leaving behind the willow, the stream, the shallow grave where the deserter's body had been laid beneath stones that would not remember his name when the thaw came. Word drifted down the line that they would cross the river today, the same river that had slipped beside them for miles now, sometimes a muddy trickle, sometimes a silver ribbon beneath low cliffs. Etienne could hear it now, its voice louder as the wind shifted, carrying the distant hiss of water beneath ice. By midday, they reached the bank. The crossing point was no bridge or ford, just a broad expanse of frozen water where the officers pointed and the sergeants barked for men to fall out by squads and test the ice ahead. Etienne stood near the edge, boots slipping on packed snow that gave way to the glassy sheen of the river's frozen skin. He could see air bubbles trapped beneath the pale crust, shadows drifting like ghosts beneath their feet. The corporal crouched, tapped the ice with the butt of his musket. Too thin, he muttered. But the road doesn't care, does it? Orders were orders. They went in groups of 10, muskets balanced across shoulders, packs cinched tight so nothing rattled. Etienne stepped onto the ice with breath held in his throat. The frozen river groaned beneath their boots, a long, shuddering sigh that made every man look at his neighbor with wide eyes and clenched jaws. Step by step they moved, boots skating over the slick. Beneath, the dark water whispered of cracks and hidden currents, of cold deep enough to drink a man whole before he could remember how to scream. Halfway across, the column slowed to a halt. Up ahead, a horse reared and danced sideways, hooves slipping on the glassy sheen. A wagon wheel shrieked as it shifted its weight, pressing down where the ice had begun to spider in fine white lines. Etienne could hear the sergeant's bark somewhere behind him, urging the line forward, urging the wheel to hold, urging the river to remember its place beneath their boots. Beside him, the corporal murmured something that sounded like a prayer, but might have been a curse. Etienne clutched his musket tight, eyes fixed on the far bank. So close he could see the thin line of birch trunks waiting to claim him back to solid ground. A crack shot through the hush, sharp, clean, cruel. A wheel dipped. Men shouted, boots scrabbling sideways as the ice buckled beneath the wagon's weight. The horse screamed, a shrill note that bounced across the river and back again. Etienne felt the jolt through his boots, the sudden give beneath his soles where water pressed up in cold blossoms that ate through the crust. He lunged forward, slipping, boots skittering over the slick. A hand caught his coat. The corporal, teeth bared in a snarl, dragging him upright. "Run, lad," the corporal hissed, pushing him ahead. They stumbled together as the ice gave a hollow sigh. Behind them, the wagon lurched, one wheel sinking half a spoke deep before catching on a hidden ridge of thicker ice. Men scrambled to drag it free, their shouts mixing with the river's long, patient groan. Etienne fixed his eyes on the trees ahead, branches black against the low winter sky. He forced his boots forward, one sliding after another, his musket banging against his shoulder in time with the thunder in his chest. At the bank, rough hands reached to haul him up. He collapsed to his knees in the snow, breath tearing at his lungs, boots soaked where water had found the seams. Behind him, the corporal climbed up too, grinning through the wheeze of cold air and fear. "Next river, we build a bridge ourselves," he rasped. Etienne barked out a laugh that tasted of iron and smoke. He looked back at the crossing. The wagon still teetered, half sunk, men heaving at its sides with shoulders hunched against the snap of ice. Beyond them, others pressed forward step by careful step, boots sliding, heads down, breath ghosting in tight bursts as if each man carried a candle cupped in trembling hands. When the last squad stumbled onto the far bank, the sergeants barked them into order again. No time for prayers, no time to thank the river for sparing more than it took. Boots found the track that vanished into the woods ahead, muskets lifted once more to tired shoulders. They trudged on in silence, boots squelching through drifts where the snow had drifted deep against fallen branches. Etienne flexed his toes inside his boots, feeling the cold creep through wet leather to bite at skin already raw from too many frozen dawns. Beside him, the corporal muttered about dry socks and warm wine. A dream so absurd it made Etienne smile in the hollow hush of the trees. He thought of Luc again, of the stories they spun by the hearth on winter nights when the river near home froze just enough to skate across in laughter and daring leaps. This river was not that river. This ice did not forgive. But as they marched deeper into the woods, Etienne pressed one palm to his chest and promised himself he would remember the sound of the ice cracking, not as a threat, but as a reminder that the road did not own him yet. The road waited, always. But so did the other bank, the far side, the chance to stand shivering in the hush and know that sometimes, just sometimes, a boy's boots could carry him safely across. The river lay behind them now, hidden by the hush of the woods and the soft crunch of snow beneath boots still damp from the crossing. Etienne felt each step like a question pressed into frozen earth. How many more miles could a boy's legs carry him before they refused to answer the road's call? For 2 days they marched through a land that seemed to grow emptier with every mile. Forests stripped bare by winter winds, fields buried in a soft hush of snow that hid the black scars of last year's harvest. They passed a farmhouse once, its roof sunken under a drift, doors swung wide to the wind. Inside, Etienne glimpsed a hearth choked with cold ash, a cradle tipped on its side in a corner where no child would sleep again. At night, they gathered in hollows where trees leaned together like old men whispering secrets overhead. Fires burned low and sullen, fed by damp twigs and the brittle bones of fallen branches. The corporal always found Etienne's side, settling his pack as a pillow, boots drawn close, musket balanced across his knees like an iron promise to whatever shadows prowled the dark. One evening, as snow fell soft as breath through the bare canopy, Etienne crouched by the fire and watched the corporal tear a scrap of salted pork with his teeth, the meat so thin it looked more memory than meal. They shared what was left in silence, passing the strip back and forth like a prayer they refused to speak aloud. After, the corporal rummaged in his coat and pulled free a small battered pipe. He packed it with pinches of dry leaf traded days ago for a strip of cloth from his old scarf. When he lit it, the scent drifted through the hush, sweet, sharp, something warmer than the fire's fickle glow. Etienne watched the smoke curl upward into the hush. "My father smoked a pipe like that," he said, voice low, eyes on the embers. "He'd sit by the window when it rained, said the pipe kept the ghosts at bay." The corporal huffed a laugh that turned to steam in the night air. "Your father was wiser than all these generals strutting about with maps and brass." He tapped the pipe's bowl against his palm. "A ghost knows its place when there's good tobacco burning." Etienne smiled, but the smile faltered when the wind shifted, carrying a scent that did not belong to pipe or pine or frost. It came thin but clear, wood smoke, sharper than their own campfire's struggling breath, and something beneath it, the faint crackle of distant burning. The corporal smelled it too. His eyes narrowed beneath the brim of his battered cap. He passed the pipe to Etienne, rose to his haunches, listening to the wind. In the dark, the other men shifted, boots scraping snow, eyes flicking to the trees, as if they too felt the world grow thinner under this new scent. At dawn, the rumor found them the way rumors always did, whispered from cookpot to sentry, passed down the line by boys too tired to wonder if the words were true. A village up ahead, torched by retreating columns, or perhaps by the same hands meant to guard it. Food stores gone, wells fouled, ash drifting over frozen fields like a second snow. By midday they found it, a ring of charred beams and blackened chimneys poking up through snowdrifts that still clung to half-burned thatch. Etienne stepped through what had once been a doorway, his boots crunching over the brittle skeleton of a hearth that would never know soup again. He found a charred toy near the ashes, a carved horse, its legs scorched black, a piece of string still wound around its belly. He crouched there, one hand brushing the soot from the horse's head, and felt something inside him slip sideways like a door that would never quite shut. Behind him, the corporal's boots squelched through the slush. "They say it keeps the enemy hungry," he said, voice flat. Better ashes than bread in another man's belly. Etienne said nothing. He turned the horse over once more, then set it gently on the cold stones where the hearth had stood. A small funeral for a boy he would never know. They bivouacked in the ruin that night because there was nowhere else to go. Fires burned where walls had once stood, flames licking old beams already half consumed. The heat was welcome, but the smell, bitter, oily, clinging to skin and hair, reminded every man that warmth could be bought from ruin as easily as from a kindly hearth. Near the shell of the church, Etienne sat with his knees drawn to his chest, cloak pulled tight against drifting flakes that found their way through broken rafters overhead. The corporal joined him, pipe cold now, bowl empty. He held it in his hands like a charm, rolling the stem between thick fingers. You think the road remembers these places? Etienne asked, voice soft. The corporal looked at him sidelong. The road forgets faster than we do. That's why it survives. Etienne thought of the orchard, the boy's wide eyes in the moonlight, the cracked crust shared under a roof that still stood. He thought of Luke. His laughter on a summer night, the taste of blackberries stolen from a neighbor's fence, the promise that there would always be another season, another harvest. But here there would be no harvest, only ashes in the wind. He reached into his coat for a scrap of paper and his stub of pencil, precious as any ration now. Beneath the open ruin of the church's beams, he wrote, Today I learned the road is greedy. It feeds on fire and leaves nothing behind for boys who dream of bread. When he finished, he folded the note and tucked it beside the lining of his coat. He pressed a hand there, as if to keep the words warm for just one more mile. Outside the walls, the snow drifted soft and careless over charred timbers and footprints that vanished as soon as they were made. Etienne pulled his cloak tighter, closed his eyes to the hush, and wondered if the road would ever lead him somewhere untouched by smoke. Dawn came late through the ruin of the village, a gray wash that spilled over the scorched beams and turned drifting flakes to drifting ash. Etienne rose from his bed of cold stones beneath what remained of the church wall, his cloak stiff with frost, boots clumsy from sleep and the brittle weight of yesterday's soot. Around him, the regiment moved like ghosts among ghosts. Boys stirred, half-buried in snowdrifts beside the blackened skeletons of barns, muttering curses that froze in the air as soon as they left their lips. Somewhere, a pot rattled over a mean fire built from broken pews. The smell of burnt wood clung to every sleeve, every cuff, every breath. By the time they were called to stand, the sky had begun to brighten in a bruised streak above the trees. The corporal fell in beside Etienne as if he'd always belonged there. Pipe tucked in his coat, boots wrapped in rags to hold back the bite of the wind that prowled between the ruins. They marched east again, always east. The old road wound from the cindered village through a stretch of low fields buried beneath crusts of wind-scoured snow. Here and there a frozen garden wall jutted from the drifts, stones stacked by hands long gone, a reminder that someone had once believed these fields worth tending. By midday, they found the crows. A hush fell through the column as the first black shapes rose ahead, a swirl of dark wings disturbed by footsteps crunching over the packed track. Etienne felt his boots slow without meaning to. He smelled it before he saw. Iron and rot beneath the cold, a scent that no frost could bury deep enough. They crested a small rise, and there they were, sprawled in the shallow hollow where a skirmish had flared and guttered out like a guttering flame. Blue coats and dark coats tangled in the snow, half covered by drifts in the crows' black hunger. Muskets still in frozen hands, shakos half buried in crusted footprints already blurred by the wind. No orders to bury them came this time. There was no time for graves in frozen earth. The sergeants barked only to keep moving. Eyes front, boots steady, muskets lifted high so no man would see too long what waited when the road grew teeth. But Etienne could not look away. He saw the boy near the edge, no older than himself, coat unbuttoned where someone had tugged it open in a desperate search for warmth or coin or breadcrumbs. His mouth hung slack, eyes wide and glazed, snow drifting across his lashes like a mercy. Beside Etienne, the corporal muttered a curse under his breath. He stooped once, just once, and tugged a scrap of cloth from beneath the dead boy's collar. a scarf rough woven, the color of wheat fields in summer. He tucked it into Etienne's coat without asking. "Better you than the crows," the corporal said. Etienne wanted to thank him, but found his tongue heavy, pinned by the sight of the scarf's loose fringe brushing his chest. When they moved on, the crows settled again behind them, black wings folding over the hush as if nothing had passed at all. That night they made camp in a stand of birches whose white trunks caught the moonlight and scattered it in thin spears across the snow. Fires burned low, fed by branches so green they hissed more than they flamed. The corporal sat across from Etienne, pipe unlit, turning the boy's scarf over in his hands. "He was no deserter," the corporal said finally. "Boots still on, musket close. Just luck ran out faster than the road did." Etienne nodded. He pulled the scarf tighter around his neck, felt the scratch of its rough weave against skin gone raw from too many nights in the open air. For a moment it almost smelled like smoke that was not from burning beams or scorched rafters, but from a hearth somewhere honest, where soup steamed and mothers waited. When he slept, he dreamed not of crows or ruined villages, but of Luke again. Not the Luke of parades or songs of empire, but the brother who once lifted him onto his shoulders to pluck cherries from the orchard trees while the sun bent low behind the fields. In the dream, Luke laughed, the sound warm as bread fresh from the oven. But behind the orchard he heard the road too, the steady drum of boots that never tired, never turned for home. He woke with the scarf still curled beneath his chin like a promise that no drumbeat could claim. At dawn, the sergeants woke them rough and quick. Word spread fast. A column was sighted near the distant tree line. Maybe theirs. Maybe not. No time to wait and find out which flag it carried. Packs were shouldered. Boots thudded back into the same ruts pressed by so many feet before. The corporal fell into step beside him, shoulders squared against the cold. "When you write your letters tonight, lad," he said, voice low, "write about the crows too. Let someone know they wait for us, same as they waited for those boys in the hollow." Etienne nodded. He would. He would write it all. The crows, the ruined village, the scent of scorched beams drifting across fields that should have grown wheat instead of ghosts. When they reached the next ridge, Etienne glanced back once. The birches stood silver and silent where they had slept. Beyond them the hollow was hidden by snow and hush, but he knew the crows still circled there, wings cutting black spirals through the pale morning sky. The road bent east again, always east. But in the hollow of his coat, the scarf pressed warm against his collarbone, rough, plain, stubborn as hope. And as his boots fell in line with the 1,000 others that trudged ahead, Etienne promised himself that when the road at last forgot him, when the crows came for his bones as they came for every boy who walked too far from home, there would be a scrap left behind. A word, a line, a whisper carried in the wind that said, "Once we dreamed of orchards, once we dreamed of bread,